Hello, welcome back to the Truth to You podcast. We are here in the city center of Thessalonica. Of course, we as Bible readers know this area as Thessalonica, and already in your mind you should know who's responsible for writing those books of the Bible. Of course, it's Paul. We're on the journeys of Paul, and we've kind of entered this phase where we're sort of going backwards through his journey once he got here to the area that is called Macedonia. Now, as he's across the sea, he receives this vision. The Bible calls it the Macedonian call. And the vision of the man saying, come over and help us. And so that really is what spurns this evangelistic tour throughout both northern, central, and southern Greece. And so he gets on a boat, he leaves, he comes over here to the port of what is modern day now, Kavala. And he's there for a while. He goes about 20 minutes inland to Philippi. And from Philippi, he then comes this direction, which is about an hour and 45 minutes if you're driving in a car, much longer, obviously, when he's taking foot. He comes here to the city of Thessalonica. Now, what's going on in the city when Paul comes here? Well, it's Roman ruled, and that's very evident from the time he enters the city. You can tell from the architecture, you can tell by the temples, the gods that the people were worshiping. It all points to this idea of Roman rule, and so much of it Rome incorporated from actual Greek mythology. So we're here, and this is called the Roman Forum. And if you take a second and you just look out, you see this passageway here where there would have been pillars. And somewhere in this area, we would have found a place called the Bema. And the Bema is important because judging happened there, and most likely this area right here is where the house of Jason would have been brought. Now you say, who is the house of Jason? Well, let's sort of get a running start, and I want to read some scriptures here for you. And the Bible actually says, in Acts chapter 17, it says, but the Jews which believed not moved with envy. So what does Paul do? As was his custom, again and again, he goes to the synagogue, he preaches Jesus. And he does that for 3 days, but some believed, but then some believed not, moved with envy, took unto them certain lewd fellows of a baser sort, gathered a company, and set all the city in an uproar. Does this sound familiar? I mean, this process was almost repeated in many of the cities that Paul visited in Greece. So there's an uproar, and what happens? And they assaulted the house of Jason. Jason was a believer, and Jason had gotten saved. And the Bible says his whole household was following the Lord. So what did these people that were offended at the gospel do? They look for Christians to persecute. And so that happens. They assaulted the house of Jason. The Bible says they sought to bring them out to the people. And when they found them not, talking about Paul, they drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city. That would have been right out this direction. And they cried this, these that have turned the world upside down are come hither also. And then listen to this verse, whom Jason hath received, and these all do contrary, listen to this, to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, one Jesus. This is very important. As Paul enters the city, there's all kinds of worship going on, worship to the Greek gods. There's also worship to the emperor. You see, they worshiped men, sometimes when they were living, but certainly when these men would pass away, they worshiped their rulers. And there was but one king in that day, and that king was Caesar. And so Paul comes in, and what is he doing? He's saying he's presenting King Jesus, as opposed to, this king that the whole culture had set up and was going about worshiping. Paul's message was counter to the culture. And they said, hey, that these men ought to be dealt with. The house of Jason then, of course, was persecuted. Paul goes on to another city to preach the gospel. But you know what? Paul never forgot about Thessalonica, because it's not long after he left here that he ends up in Corinth, and while he's there, he writes to the Thessalonian believers. But notice the topic that he talks about. He brings up in his first letter to the Thessalonians, he brings up the second coming. Now, why does he do that? Well, because there's all this persecution going on, and he addresses the fact that, hey, listen, one day the Lord is going to come back for us. One day we'll be with him in heaven. One day we'll be a part of that eternal kingdom. Again, it was a kingdom that was visible, that was counterculture to the gospel. Paul described a different kingdom. And then the second letter, he talks all about persecution because he knew these believers, including the house of Jason, were being persecuted. So how does this relate to where we're at? Well, it's quite obvious from having visited much of Greece, been to these museums, that the over-prevailing message of the era, as they have collected artifacts of antiquity, sculptures, placards, carvings of all kind, they're all pointing to these worship of other gods. And you know what is the legacy from that time? Well, for Thessalonica, we go to this museum, and the legacy for them is just, artifacts made with hands. But Paul referenced, even in his letter to the Corinthians, he said, hey, you know what? We have a reward that's not been crafted with hands. It's an eternal, it's a spiritual reward. And so that encouraged the believers in this era, and I believe the Lord wants to use that message to encourage believers in our era today. Impressive place to be. You can see and hear the sounds of the modern city. But as we leave Thessalonica, I'm carrying with me some of the messages that the Lord relayed to Paul to share to these believers. Hey, thanks for joining us. We look forward to another episode in the future. Take care.